welcome you to the 2025 Toynbee Prize Lecture. That's why we're here. And I'm welcoming you on behalf of the European University Institute Interdisciplinary Cluster, from the International to the Planetary, and the EUI Department of History, and the Toynbee Prize Foundation. So it's a triple effort collaboration. My name is Glenda Sluger. I'm Joint Professor in International History and Capitalism here at the EUI. And I'm introducing the speaker because I'm meant to represent all three of those groups. So some background on the prize. I thought I should let you in on what the Toynbee Prize is. It was named for Arnold Toynbee, who's very well known, I think, to historians at least. He was a British classicist who, in the mode common to the early half of the 20th century, became an important influence on international political thought and even international relations, among other things. He was one of those classicists who was taken along as a delegate to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, for example. So in those days, the ancient world and the modern were much more connected. The Toynbee Prize Foundation was chartered in 1987 with the generous idea of the ability of historians more generally to offer reflection on the present and actively influence the future, which I think is something to aspire to. The charter itself read that the Toynbee Prize would aim to contribute to the development of the social sciences as defined from a broad historical view of human society and of human and social problems. So since then, though, the foundation has broadened its repertoire, if you like. So apart from the prize, you can go to www.toynbee.org and find that there is a lot of information there, much of it generated by young scholars who are interested in global history. And some of our researchers here are editors at large for the Toynbee Prize Foundation online site. They're publishing blogs and interviews, as you'll find out in the future, because this afternoon, some of our researchers interviewed, in fact, Professor Amrith, who is going to give the prize lecture today. Now, the prize itself, I just would like to mention, which is awarded every other year, and to recognise outstanding historical scholarship, is usually accompanied by a lecture by the winner, who's given a bit of advance notice before having to present the lecture. And usually it's at the American Historical Association meeting every 2 years. But this year, like the last round, in fact, the Toynbee Prize lecture has been presented here at the EUI, luckily for us. And past winners who haven't presented here, but it might be worth knowing about to understand the lineage into which our current winner fits, include Raymond Aron, Jean-Paul Sartre, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Sir Brian Urquhart, Barbara Ward, Albert Hirschman, George Kennan, Lord Kenneth Clarke, Sir Ralph Durrendorff, Michael Foote, Buckminster Fuller, John McNeill, Jürgen Osterhammel, Kenneth Pomerantz, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Natalie Zeman-Davis, Sir Christopher Bailey, Lauren Benton, Dipesh Chakrabarti, and the last winners who presented here, Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper. So in 2025, the recipient of the Toynbee Prize is Sunil Amrith. Sunil Amrith is the Renu and Anand Dwan Professor of History at Yale University and currently the Henry R. Luce Director of the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. He has been awarded the Toynbee Prize for his exceptional work on the movement of peoples as shaped by environmental forces, work that has brought to the regions of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, brought those regions to the center of global historical research. Professor Amrith is an extraordinary historian. His probing commitment to questions of global scale inequality has significantly broadened our understanding of the global past. He has shifted how we see the world in the past and the present. His wide-ranging and ambitious scholarship work has added unheard voices and made history matter. It has shaped many, many strands of global history, from health to environment and so much more. His books include Unruly Waters, How Rains, Rivers, Coasts and Seas Have Shaped Asia's History. That was shortlisted for the 2019 Condell Prize. Crossing the Bay of Bengal, The Furies of Nature and the Fortunes of Migrants, which was awarded the American Historical Association's John F. Richards Prize in 2014 and selected as an editor's choice title by the New York Times Book Review. His most recent book, The Burning Earth, A History, is an environmental history of the modern world that foregrounds the experiences of the global South. And even though it's only recently come out, it was selected as an essential read of 2024 by The New Yorker and as a book of the year by The New Statesman, The Hindu, and NPR. And it's currently being translated into 10 languages. So the Toynbee Prize that Sunil has received is actually sitting on a shelf full of awards, including the 2024 Fukuoka Academic Prize, awarded to recognize distinguished contributions to the study of Asian cultures, the 2022 Heineken Prize for History, the Falling Walls Foundation 2022 Scientific Breakthrough of the Year, a 2017 MacArthur Fellowship, the one that everybody wants, and the 2016 Emphasize Prize in Humanities. He's come to us in the middle of delivering lectures at All Souls that celebrate the work of Radhakrishnan, who also was a Toynbee Prize winner, as I've just been able to tell Sunil. So if you can't get to those lectures or read his books, you can read him in various opinion pieces in the New York Times and Financial Times recently, reminding us of the environmental costs of war. You can also hang around now and hear him present the 2025 Toynbee Prize Lecture on Whose Planetary Consciousness. So the lecture will be recorded for the EUI and Toynbee websites, and after we'll have time for questions, and the questions won't be recorded, so you don't have to worry about that. But I just want to thank Sunil very much for coming across from the UK to give this lecture for us today. And welcome to the EUI. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda, for such a kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful. It's the first time I've visited EUI. It's wonderful to be here. Glenda and I first met 22 years ago when I was a PhD student. I was working on the World Health Organization at that time, and Glenda had just started working on UNESCO. We wrote an article together that came out, I think, a few years later. And while my work, like Glenda's, has looped off in many different directions since then, I do find myself regularly returning to an interest in internationalism and international organizations. And Glenda's inspiration is really important to that core thread through everything I've done. So thank you for that too. In the 2 years between the time that Hannah Arendt delivered the Charles Walgreen Lectures at the University of Chicago in 1956, and the publication of a revised version of those talks as The Human Condition 2 years later, the Soviet satellite Sputnik orbited the Earth. Arendt saw this as a pivot in human history, even more fundamental than the splitting of the atom. And she perceived that the human response, the public response to spaceflight, was not pride or awe at the tremendousness of human power or mastery. Rather, Arendt detected a sense of relief. Relief at the prospect of what she called a step toward escape from men's imprisonment to the Earth. First in science fiction and now in popular consciousness, she said, that earthbound fate felt like imprisonment. The quest to reach outer space shared something with the fight to extend the human lifespan. Both expressed what Arendt called a sense of rebellion against human existence as it has been given. The prospect that now beckoned was cutting the last tie through which even man belongs among the children of nature. Cutting the last tie through which even man belongs among the children of nature. Arendt identified a paradox. By breaking the limits of human existence as it has been given, technological change now threatened the boundaries which protected the world, she said, the human artifice from nature. What might have appeared as a decisive victory in this battle, the final human liberation from earthly nature, was anything but that. As technology broke one after another of the natural boundaries, creating life in the lab, deferring death, destroying disease, making land where there was none, breaking free of the earth itself, the life sciences unleashed could now see human beings as an animal species like any other. And that was Arendt's nightmare. Arendt elucidated the dilemma. The earth, she said, is the very quintessence of the human condition. And earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing human beings with a habitat in which they can move and breathe without effort and without artifice. Come back to that quotation later in my talk. The idea of the planetary or planetarity has stimulated a lot of recent work in light of the climate crisis. Some have suggested that planetary humanities may be the next frontier in our disciplines. Expanding on a set of ideas that he set forth in his influential 2009 critical inquiry essay, Dipesh Chakrabarty describes something inexorably seeping into the everyday historical consciousness. And that is the planet, however dimly sensed, is emerging as a matter of broad and deep human concern. Drawing on Chakrabarty is a recent book by Jonathan Blake and Niels Gilman, who argue that an increasingly precise understanding of how the Earth system operates and how its subsystems interoperate has enabled, indeed necessitates, a fundamental rethinking of the human place on the planet. They describe that new awareness, that rethinking, as the condition of planetarity. The fundamental question I want to ask this evening is, who has access to that condition of planetarity? Whose planetary consciousness are we talking about? Because the answer to that question has implications for how far the planetary, as a category of analysis, as a point of view, as a rallying cry, will or won't enhance our understanding of life as it is lived under conditions of accelerating climate change. It's important to ask whose planetary consciousness also as we determine what form of politics it will open up or forestall. The planetary view of the human place on Earth is specifically a product of modern scientific measurement. Certainly that's Gilman and Blake's definition. They would not, I presume, see planetary consciousness in, for example, the worldview famously described by Benedict Anderson in his essay on Javanese theories of power, one in which power is manifested in every aspect of the natural world, in stones, trees, clouds, and fire. Perhaps they would see that as cosmic rather than planetary, because planetarity's condition of possibility, Blake and Gilman insist, lies in planetary instrumentation and technologies of perception. That is to say, it depends on data combined with Earth systems science. But I think they might miss an additional and necessary condition of possibility, and that is domination. Domination over the Earth and everything on it, which accompanied the heyday of European imperialism. In the first part of my talk, I will trace one lineage of planetary consciousness that delves into those imperial origins. And the technology of perception that made that possible was in fact the color photograph. So I'd like to start with Albert Kahn, son of a cattle trader who joined the exile of Alsatian Jews to Paris after the Franco-Prussian War. As a young man in Paris, his personal tutor was none other than Henri Bergson. Kahn found work as a clerk in the Goodshow Bank, which specialized in mining ventures. And he made his fortune from South African rock, from gold and diamonds, the very rock that Gabrielle Hecht has treated as what she calls an interscalar vehicle, connecting the scarred lungs of Black miners with intergenerational toxic waste and global economic transformation. Kahn gained preferential access to shares in the De Beers Corporation and then invested profitably in the Witwatersrand gold mines. Ever restless, he went on to broker French investment in Japanese railways. He invested in Norsk Hydro, established to harness the energy of the Yukon waterfall. But its real promise lay in an invention of Christian Birkeland, who'd patented a way to conjure nitrogen from air using powerful electrical arcs. And until the Haber-Bosch process about a decade later, this was the most promising way to capture nitrogen to make it usable by plants. Khan made his money from the global rush that is to turn nature into commodities. But though he'd made his fortune in the extractive boom of the early 20th century, Khan felt that the world was changing faster than he could fathom. He was a pacifist, alarmed by the rise of militarism in Europe. And as he prepared for a round-the-world business trip in 1908, he had an idea. He was drawn to the power of the color photograph to document this transformation of the world. Khan set out to create nothing less than a visual archive of the whole planet. And that's what he called it, les archives de la planète. Khan's confidant, the geologist Emmanuel Jacquin de Mergerie, described the ambition behind it. This is Mergerie. While there is still time, Mr. Khan was wanting to create what he called the archives de la planète, that is, to put into effect a sort of photographic inventory of the surface of the globe as it is inhabited and developed by man at the beginning of the 20th century. The Archives de la Planète was built on a sense of urgency, while there is still time, to capture the world on the threshold of irreversible change. As Khan put it, the archive would fix once and for all the look, practice, and modes of human activity whose fatal disappearance is just a question of time. Khan appointed the geographer Jean Brunès as director of the archive, and Brunès shared with Khan a sense of living through momentous change. From 1909 to 1931, Khan's archives sent photographers to 50 countries, all of them men, except for Madeleine Mignon and Marguerite Mespoulet, both of whom had received travel grants from Khan's foundation. Together, they took the world's largest collection of 72,000 autochromes, using a technology that had been invented by the Lumière brothers, Louis and Auguste, and first demonstrated at the Paris offices of the periodical L'Illustration in 1907. I want to mention here Paula Ahmad's brilliant book on the Khan archive from the perspective of film studies, as well as a collected volume by Bjorli and Jacobsen. Both have been influential in helping me to ask new questions of the archive, in my case from the perspective of environmental history. I'm just going to give you 4 from the 72,000 autochromes, just to give you a sense of the visual register of the archive. As you can see, this is a familiar tradition of colonial documentary photography. Orientalist tropes are everywhere to be seen. But there's also something different, and that is the scale and self-consciousness that this is a planetary. The Khan archive assembled a kaleidoscopic portrait. That is, its effect came from aggregation. The images were synchronous. That is, the photographers visited each site probably only once, and they often stayed only for a short time before moving on. The archive tried to convey temporal change through spatial contrast. Its photographs juxtaposed the pre-modern and modern parts of the world as if they were on a continuum, with Mongolia at one end, as you see there, and New York City on the other, as if the parts of the world least affected by technological change were ghosts of what the industrial world once was, and as if their own future transformation was inevitable, ordained by progress. And in the images, railways cut through prairie, dams tear through forests, deep shaft mines strip the earth. The inventory captures a moment in the long human struggle to harness and control the rest of nature, a moment when the advantage seemed to lie decisively on the side of technology. So Khan's was a humanist, not a scientific gesture towards a new planetary consciousness. It resonated with other visions. Khan formed a friendship with Rabindranath Tagore, who himself enters Khan's archives in this photograph, which was taken while Tagore visited Khan's estate in Boulogne. Khan and Tagore shared many elements of a worldview, and Tagore himself gestured at a sense of planetary transformation. In 1922, just a year after this photo was taken, Tagore wrote an interplanetary parable. He imagined a now extinct race of intelligent beings on another planet, and this is how he describes their downfall. Through machinery of tremendous power, this race made such an addition to their natural capacity that their career of plunder entirely outstripped nature's power for recuperation. The profit makers dug big holes in the stored capital of the planet. They created wants which were unnatural, and provision for these wants was forcibly extracted from nature. They exhausted the water, cut down the trees, reduced the surface of the planet to a desert riddled with enormous pits, and made its interior a rifled pocket, emptied of its valuables. To make his point very explicit in case his readers missed it, Tagore continued that these creatures of another planet in another time behaved exactly in the way human beings of today are behaving upon this earth. The crucial area where Khan and Tagore differed in their analyses was when it came to empire. To Tagore, it was all too clear that this planetary destruction was a result of rapacious imperialism. Khan's planetary archive, for its part, was beholden to the networks of the French Empire in particular. I'd like to consider some of its paradoxes. Khan's project was utopian and outward-looking, cosmopolitan, yet it provided the French colonial enterprise with free publicity. Khan upheld a turn-of-the-century vision of endless and inevitable progress, but he viewed this outcome with ambivalence. His archive portrayed the dignity of older and less extractive ways of living on this earth, suggesting at the same time, however, that they were inevitably doomed. The archive was made possible by the wealth of Khan, the international banker, despite which its most lasting effect is the visual testimony of capitalism's human and ecological cost. Perhaps the biggest paradox, though, is this. It was a universal archive that was cloistered away in a mansion on the outskirts of Paris and not seen by anyone until the early 21st century. So from this knot of contradictions, I think, yes, a new sense of planetary consciousness emerges. It's an extension of vision, as one of Khan's associates put it, but one open only to a very few. To be able to see the whole planet like this was, in a sense, to have confidence in one's possession of it. The point where Khan's archive intersects with the quite different and largely scientific history of science genealogy for planetary consciousness offered by recent scholars lies in the archive of the planet's innovations in aerial photography, which is something that Paula Ahmad explores in a fascinating paper. Brunès, the archives director, invoked the power of what he called a general glance over the Earth to unveil an entirely new and very abundant set of surface phenomena. There are towns and railways, cultivated fields and quarries, canals and irrigation tanks and salt pans. And here and there, in particular, there are masses of groups of various densities of human beings. Ahmad describes the view that opens up as a radically relativist scan of the Earth, in which human activity and habitation is a fragment within a larger picture. Brunès anthropomizes geology and he geologizes humanity. In Brunès's words, the surface of the Earth is the skin of our planet. An environmental extraction he described as murder. Ahmad calls this a curious mixture of machine-age posthumanism with a revitalized neo-humanism. And in that aerial view, which is very much part of the Khan archive, something of an anticipation for the image that later scholars and environmental historians have seen as so pivotal towards fostering a planetary consciousness. And of course, that is the famous blue marble. So I think we can trace a longer lineage for what becomes the ultimate source of planetary consciousness, which is the view of Earth from space. Sitting alongside a history of scientific knowledge and measurement is a history of awareness that makes a planetary view possible through awareness of the planetary scale of extraction, what Tagore referred to as the rifled pocket of the planet. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the possibility of seeing the Earth this way, worried that this would be breaking the last tie, by which even man is among the children of nature. And she worried in particular, as I suggested at the outset, that this would erode the boundaries which protected the world, the human artifice, from nature. Now, that sense of a human artifice protecting the world from nature is in some ways the very core of what was the developmentalist project in the second half of the 20th century. And this leads me to the question, what did planetary consciousness mean from the perspective of the post-colonial world? Because in the 1960s and 70s, scientists and political leaders from the third world engaged directly with what we are calling the planetary scale. But their reflections have been ignored or erased from most recent discussions of planetarity. And I think they're worth revisiting, especially for their awareness of complexity and contradiction. So let me turn to this now from the perspective of India. Vikram Sarabhai was an astronomer, physicist, and businessman from a wealthy industrial family that had supported India's freedom movement. His activities in the 50s and 60s were multifaceted. He helped set up the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. He brought the techniques of market research to India. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes, he was instrumental in the development of India's space program. In December 1970, just a few months before his sudden death at the age of 52, Sarabhai addressed a meeting of the Indian Geophysical Union, and he gave them a presentation on what he called remote sensing in the service of developing countries. He began by distinguishing between what he called outward and inward space exploration. Outward space exploration had been Arendt's concern in the human condition, this breaking free of planetary imprisonment. Sarabhai was quick to dismiss this as of no real concern or relevance to the developing world. What he was interested in is what he called inward exploration, or looking back towards the Earth from space. Sarabhai described the role of remote sensing in terms of the use of modern sensors, data processing equipment, information theory, space and airborne vehicles, and large systems theory and practice in coordination of the relevant Earth sciences. So yes, Sarabhai is describing exactly what Blake and Gilman call planetary instrumentation and technologies of perception, but for a very different purpose. Not for the rethinking of the human place on the planet, but rather to identify what Sarabhai called the resources on the Earth's surface or just below it, and to hasten their extraction. The promise of the planetary scale, Sarabhai thought, lay in its ability to make visible the local scale of the soil and what lay beneath it. Sarabhai described India's first experiment with remote sensing, which was a collaboration between the Indian Space Research Organization and NASA, to use a helicopter and a 70mm Hasselblad camera to fly low over a Kerala coconut plantation to detect wilt disease. They found that infected trees recorded weaker infrared reflectance from the aerial images. The aerial view here from a helicopter, but also in Sarabhai's account from satellites, cast light, quite literally, on the profoundly local in service of the developmental project, boosting production and especially export production. Sarabhai was excited by the possibilities of remote sensing for exploring oil and gas deposits, as well as for charting groundwater levels in an India that was then in the grip of the water-hungry green revolution. I'm just going to show you a very short video clip from a 1971 documentary called India and Space, and you can see the developmental language at work here.
Specially instrumented aircraft and satellites are being sent up for the measurement of the Earth's resources. These data are sent back to the Earth in the form of photographs. This technique is known as remote sensing. This is nowadays being applied for detecting the plant diseases in good time. These pictures of coconut trees taken for the first time are to be related to the information of the individual coconut trees at the two research stations, Kasaragod and Kayamkulam. This is something like studying the case histories of patients and deducing their illnesses from symptoms.
Two things I'd like to point to there. One is the analogy with taking the case history of a patient and deducing their illnesses. And so this view from above actually allows a micro scale to emerge, at least in the imagination of the planners who are excited by these technologies. Second is that image there, that remote sensing would hasten a new era of extraction, as you can see there. So the planetary view in India and other parts of the global south often states the promise of hastening, not reconsidering, social, economic, and environmental transformation. These technologies of sensing and perception were vital to what Liz Chatterjee has called late acceleration. The sense in the global south that the so-called great acceleration, which we have retrospectively reconstructed as a homogeneous process, was very uneven. And that if anything, the sense in India in 1970, 1971 was that this process was not happening fast enough. But these technologies in Sarabhai's imagination were not just about extraction. The same year in 1970, Sarabhai had spoken at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center in Bombay. And in that speech on what he called pollution in the human environment, he argued that India's leaders were wrong to think that the problem of the human environment was largely an affliction of the industrially developed. They were wrong, Sarabhai said, to think that since India was still quite remote from this problem, we can tackle it in its own time. Rather, Sarabhai insisted, influenced by systems thinking, the same systems thinking that led to his interest in remote sensing and space exploration. He insisted that the ecology of the environment and the welfare of the human being are intimately connected, and that this interdependence puts the whole problem of environmental protection in a new dimension. He stressed the cumulative and irreversible character of environmental harm, gesturing again at the planetary scale of the crisis. Many changes that occur over a period of time are sometimes erroneously believed to create no significant impact or only a very slow impact on the environment, he said. But in a cumulative, multiplicative process, it is the final stages that the whole system gets changed most and sometimes becomes uncontrollable. It is precisely this aspect of change in the biosphere that we have to be very careful about. What is most striking to me is Sarabhai's chosen instance of that sort of uncontrollable destabilization, which is in the final sentence. A typical example of such change, as he said, can be observed in the population explosion. Here we see that the condition of access to the planetary for most Indians was only as a population, not as rights-bearing citizens, not as communities, but as a population. Sarabhai was close to India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and in her important role in early global conversations about the environment in the years after Sarabhai's death, we can see how the tensions that he identified were to play out. Indira Gandhi, as is well known, was the only head of state, apart from the host Olof Palme, to attend the UN's first meeting on the human environment held in Stockholm in 1972. She'd been encouraged to attend by Sarabhai and her small coterie of scientific advisors. There are now some archival sources that show that she was initially not very interested, but in fact her scientific advisors that surrounded her told her that she needed to be there because this was a meeting that would eventually become of great relevance to India. In her much quoted plenary speech, Indira Gandhi argued that environmental degradation was primarily a problem of distribution, not of numbers. She reminded her audience that notwithstanding the conference slogan, which was one world, that we inhabit a divided world. When it came to the origins of the environmental crisis, Mrs. Gandhi was very clear about where the blame should lie. Many of the advanced countries of today have reached their present affluence by their domination over other races and countries, she said. Global economic inequality had its origins in ecological violence. And so, she said, the rich world got a head start through sheer ruthlessness, undisturbed by feelings of compassion or by abstract theories of freedom, equality, or justice. Now, poor countries were being told they could not do the same, and they feared the latter would be kicked away from them. The riches and the labor of the colonized countries played no small part in the industrialization of the West, she reminded her audience. And yet now, the provision of dignified standards of living to India's poorest citizens took place under what Gandhi called an eagle-eyed watchfulness. She conceded that environmental concerns were as much her own as those of anyone else. We do not wish to impoverish the environment any further, she insisted. And yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people. And the phrase for which her speech is best remembered actually came in the form of an ambiguous question. Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? In the run-up to Stockholm, at a gathering of non-aligned leaders in Lusaka, Indira Gandhi had pointed to the sense of planetary consciousness that came not from the view from space, but rather from the stark awareness of military power and inequality in the world, what she called the nuclear balance of terror and its capacity for planetary annihilation. And she made the argument, pointing to US chemical warfare in Vietnam, that environmental destruction was itself a tool of empire. Indira Gandhi's critique of one world thinking has continued to resonate over the decades, laying the groundwork for powerful claims for environmental justice on the international stage. Her speech at Stockholm conveyed a humane, multifaceted vision in which the health of the planet was vital for human flourishing. But for India, it would culminate in the repressive violence of population control and escalation of a project that had begun in the 1960s with extensive US support. And we can see now that a sense of ecological emergency, of time running out, fed into the wider sense of all-pervasive political and economic crisis that legitimized Indira Gandhi's declaration of a state of emergency in India in 1975. Because despite the subtle way that Indira Gandhi had articulated in Stockholm the relationship between population and ecology, she proved unable to resist the fear that population was an uncontrollable force, just as Sarabhai had articulated it. Sanjay Gandhi, her son, was unleashed in 1976 to oversee a nationwide push to sterilize poor families, many of them in mass camps. The program targeted men because of the greater ease of the surgical procedure. State governments set wild targets and local officials scrambled to meet them. Emma Tarlow showed this in her wonderful ethnography of the emergency published more than a decade ago. Some personal rights have to be kept in abeyance, Indira Gandhi announced in 1976, for the human rights of the nation, the right to life, the right to progress. So in 1976 to 77 alone, 8 million Indians underwent sterilization, many of them in camps. Some came for the incentive of cash payments. Others came because they'd been threatened with the withdrawal of ration cards and state benefits. Some of them came packed onto the backs of trucks by Congress Party workers. The sterilizations struck hardest at the poorest families, from the least privileged castes, and from religious minorities, Muslims above all. Countless people suffered injury because of botched operations. Tens of or hundreds of thousands of bodies were violated without a shred of consent. Many people died or suffered from lifelong disability. Human lives were reduced to statistical targets, their future choices reduced to the aggregate question of population control. The World Bank and American foundations provided money and support and cheered Indira Gandhi on. India's rush to population control, like China's, where Susan Greenhalgh has shown that cybernetics, systems thinking, an early form of planetary thinking, was deeply influential in formulating the one-child policy, in which the missile scientist Song Jian actually took a leading role. This embodied a way of thinking that saw the control of natural forces, including the size of a population, as a battle to be won. Moreover, Indira Gandhi's top-down embrace of environmental concern, imbued with these early currents of planetary thinking, was styled in direct opposition to movements for environmental and social justice that were proliferating in India at the time. Movements that expressed themselves not in a planetary language, but in the language of care for soils and forests, of interdependence between human communities and ecological vitality. In the best known of these movements, the Chipko Andolan in the Himalayan foothills, local activists mounted an escalating series of protests against state-sanctioned commercial logging in the foothills of the Himalayas. The destruction of the forest tore through local livelihoods by taking away common property resources, which women in particular relied on for wood, for food, and for medicine. Ecology is the permanent economy, Sundarlal Bahuguna declared. The image of women activists hugging trees, of course, became iconic around the world and acquired different meanings as it crossed contexts. For many, it dramatized the clash between resource-intensive development and the well-being of local peoples and local ecologies. And theirs was, in a sense, an inversion of Sarabhai's planetary perspective, where the view from above would pinpoint areas for further extraction. Shekhar Pathak's comprehensive and moving history of the movement, which you see on the slide, shows how deeply rooted it was in local memories of anti-colonial struggle. In fact, they called the alliance between the state and loggers contractor Raj, using the term Raj to see it as a new colonialism. It is in light of these histories, I think, that some caution is in order when we start to make claims on behalf of the planetary. Planetary consciousness, I've tried to suggest, implies planetary power. It always has done. And as we're on the threshold of large-scale geoengineering, that is more true now than ever. In an immediate sense, we can see that scientists and political decision makers from the global south, still less wider publics, have had little representation in discussions on the benefits and risks of solar geoengineering and radiation modification, as well as other forms of planetary manipulation. But the point I want to conclude with is broader than that. I'd like to suggest that appeals to planetarity or planetary consciousness may in fact represent a narrowing rather than an expansion of the range of possible visions of how we should inhabit an imperiled world. Visions that take fuller cognizance of all the possible versions of that we. Let us return to Arendt. In The Human Condition, she wrote, "Earthly nature, for all we know, may be unique in the universe in providing human beings with a habitat in which they can move and breathe without effort and without artifice." She wrote those words just a year before Frantz Fanon would write of Black and colonized people around the world that the individual's breathing is an observed, an occupied breathing. It is a combat. Arendt, who paid relatively little attention to the third world, did not consider that a large proportion of humanity could neither breathe nor move without effort and without artifice in the late 1950s, or indeed even 2 decades later. And the promise of escape from Earth's shackles meant little to those who'd yet to enjoy the promise of earthly comfort and security. Achille Mbembe touched on this during the pandemic. He noted that all these wars on life begin by taking away breath. Mbembe invoked a universal right to breathe. We must reclaim the lungs of our world with a view to forging new ground, he writes, seeing in that universal right to breathe something that transcends the purely human. When Indonesian investigative journalists writing for the dissident magazine Tempo wrote about the forest fires of Kalimantan in the early 1980s, ignited by plantation companies seeking to clear land for palm oil, they had reached for a similar metaphor. They wrote of terpanggangnya paru-paru bumi, the charred lungs of the earth. The Bahasa Bumi derives from Sanskrit, and even in that long history of that word transferring across languages between South and Southeast Asia, we also have a transition in its meaning from a cosmos to, in this case, the planet. The charred lungs of the earth. The writers discerned connections between the damaged lungs of local people and the charred lungs of the earth. They linked colonial legacies of unequal land ownership with a critique of the Suharto regime's authoritarian kleptocracy. They explored local meanings of land and landscape. We could read into their work, into the work of the first generation of Indonesian environmental journalists, a form of planetary consciousness. But I think that would be to impoverish rather than honor the creative and investigatory work that they were doing. We come back to the question, in whose name and to what ends do we make appeals to the planetary or planetary consciousness? Dipesh Chakrabarty leaves this productively open-ended. A sense of the planetary is inexorably seeping into the everyday historical consciousness, he writes, but there was and still is the human of humanist histories, the human capable of struggling for equality and fairness among other humans while caring for the environment and certain non-human life. But there's an ambivalence there. There was and still is. And still is in parentheses, hesitant. So it's hard not to get a sense that we are talking about a progression, a transition from a limited human consciousness towards a planetary consciousness. Blake and Gilman, for their part, are quite straightforward about where they see planetary consciousness leading. They argue for putting people with expertise in the relevant planetary phenomena at the center of the decision-making process. They ask few questions about where that expertise is located and imagine something like a new planetary technocracy. The flagship initiative at my own university at Yale is called Planetary Solutions. It is a responsible and necessary effort to start conversations about climate change and biodiversity across disciplinary boundaries. I'm confident it'll produce important work, especially in the sciences. But it is the satellite view. And the visual representation, of course, has no people in it. And it feels sometimes disconnected from this. A series of posters about the climate crisis by school children in New Haven, which is one of the most unequal small cities in America. Theirs is not a satellite view, but a view from the poisoned ground and water of a segregated post-industrial city struggling for the freedom to breathe. In its own way, I think this is just as capacious, expansive, and galvanizing as a planetary perspective, perhaps even more so. Thank you very much.